Gideon Coulter stared at the paper, the lawyer's words still hanging in the dusty air like a bad joke. He read the line again. An island. His uncle Ezra, a man who owned profitable ranches and a stake in the town's only bank, had left him and his brother a rock. A barren, worthless rock jutting out of the water that everyone in the territory called the Devil's Tooth. Beside him, his brother Sterling was silent. Too silent. Sterling was never silent. His fingers tapped a frantic, unreadable rhythm on the scarred wooden table. The lawyer had already packed his briefcase, eager to be done with them. He'd made it clear the island was a joke. No trees, no soil, no value. Nothing. So why this? Why leave them a punchline in his will? Uncle Ezra had good land, Sterling finally said, his voice low and tight, a cord pulled taut. He had cattle, a business. The old man lost his mind, Gideon snapped, folding the deed with sharp, angry creases. You heard the talk. But Sterling wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on something else. A second document, tucked just behind the official deed. It was older, the paper yellowed and brittle. As Sterling's eyes scanned the page, all the color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Gideon reached for it. What is it? Sterling snatched it back, his movement sharp and protective. He looked at his brother, and for the first time in a decade, Gideon saw real fear in his eyes. A deep, cold fear that had nothing to do with money or land. It says we have to go to the island, Sterling whispered. Today. That's crazy. We're selling it. Henderson will give us a few dollars just to say he owns an island. No. The word was absolute. It cut through the air and made the fine hairs on Gideon's arms stand up. We can't sell it. Not yet. Outside, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and the lawyer fumbled with the key to his door. Something in the room had shifted. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. Sterling carefully folded the strange document, tucking it deep inside his vest pocket as if it were a fragile, dangerous secret. Trust me, Gideon, he said, his eyes pleading. Just this once. But trust was a hard currency to come by. Especially now, with Sterling's hand hovering over his pocket, guarding a piece of paper that felt like it could shatter their entire world. They walked out onto the dusty street, the silence between them a chasm. Behind them, the lawyer locked his door, but he gave the deed one last curious look. Neither brother saw the man watching from the shadows of the alley across the street. He'd been standing there for an hour, perfectly still, and he was waiting for this exact moment. He had been waiting a very, very long time. The boat bucked against the dock, eager to be free. Gideon checked the ropes, the simple, familiar task a small comfort against the knot of unease in his gut. Before them, the gray water stretched to a hazy horizon, and out there, somewhere in the mist, was their inheritance. A worthless rock. Sterling stood at the prow, his hand still pressed to the document in his vest. He hadn't said another word about what it contained, just packed supplies with a grim, feverish intensity. We could still turn back, Gideon said, his voice rough against the cry of the gulls. Sell it to Henderson. Take the money. Henderson has no idea what he'd be buying, Sterling said, his voice flat. He wasn't looking at Gideon. He was staring out at the water, at the unseen island. And you do? Sterling finally turned. His eyes were wild, a storm of fear and something else Gideon couldn't name. A desperate, impossible hope. Uncle Ezra wasn't crazy, Gid. He wasn't losing his mind. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He was protecting something. The wind whipped around them, cold and sharp. Protecting what? On a barren rock? Without another word, Sterling pulled the document from his vest. His hands shook as he held it out. Gideon took the yellowed paper. The script was their uncle's, but the words were a mad scramble of notes. Compass bearings, Tidal charts, measurements between bizarre rock formations. It was the journal of a madman. Until Gideon saw the last line scrawled at the bottom of the page. A line that turned his blood to ice. They cannot know what lies beneath. Not until the brothers come together. What does this mean? Gideon's voice was barely audible over the wind. It means, Sterling said, stepping into the rocking boat with a new, sudden purpose. He didn't leave us an island. He left us a responsibility. As they pushed off from the dock, a flicker of movement from the shore caught Gideon's eye. It was the same man from town, the Watcher, standing half hidden behind the general store, a dark silhouette against the morning light. He was too far to see his face, but they could feel his eyes on them. Sterling saw him too, and his jaw tightened. He's been watching us since we left the lawyer's office. The brothers shared a look. No words were needed. Whatever secret their uncle had hidden on that island, they weren't the only ones who knew about it. And they weren't the only ones trying to claim it. "Row!" Sterling hissed, his knuckles white on the oars. "Row faster!" They bent their backs to the task, pulling away from the shore, from the watching man, from the world they knew. But as the mist began to swallow the coastline behind them, neither of them saw the second boat. It slipped out from the far side of the harbor, a sleek, dark shape moving with silent speed, staying just far enough back to be lost in the gray morning haze. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. The island clawed its way out of the sea, a jagged spine of black rock against a steel-gray sky. It looked like the bone of some long-dead monster. Gideon dragged their small boat onto the narrow, pebbled shore, while Sterling stood watch, his eyes scanning the empty horizon behind them. The boat that had been hunting them was gone, vanished as if the mist itself had swallowed it whole. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. It was stronger here, a prickling on the back of their necks, a sense that the very rocks had eyes. "Someone followed us," Sterling stated, his voice tight. "Maybe they gave up," Gideon said, shouldering a pack. He didn't believe it for a second. The island was even more desolate up close. No trees, no life, just coarse grass clinging stubbornly to cracks in the stone. It was exactly what everyone said it was. Worthless. A grave marker in the middle of the ocean. They started to climb, the rocks slick and treacherous under their boots. They were about 50 feet up when Sterling stopped dead. "Gideon." His voice was sharp. He was pointing. It was a line of stones, each one about the size of a man's head, arranged in a perfect straight line. Too perfect. This was no act of nature. Someone had placed them here. The line of stones formed a crude arrow, pointing deeper into the island's barren interior. Gideon knelt, tracing the edges of the rocks. He could see the faint marks left by tools. "This wasn't done recently," he said, his voice hushed. "These marks are old. Ancient." Sterling pulled out their uncle's strange document. He checked the compass, took a few measurements, his lips moving silently. His face went white. The directions on the paper, the angles and the distances, they matched the stone markers perfectly. Uncle Ezra had been here. He knew about this. They followed the stone arrow, their unease growing with every step. The path led them past more formations, each one more deliberate, more unnatural than the last. Massive boulders had been moved, positioned to align with what? The sun? The stars? It was a massive, silent, stone machine, and they were walking right into its gears. The path ended abruptly, opening into a huge, natural amphitheater. Towering walls of rock enclosed the space on 3 sides, making it feel like a cathedral built by giants. In the very center sat a single, massive, flat-topped stone. An altar. Its surface was covered in a dizzying network of shallow grooves, carved in swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe if you stared at them for too long. What is this place? Gideon whispered, the sound swallowed by the immense space. Sterling was studying his uncle's notes again, his eyes wide with a manic excitement. According to this, we're standing directly above it. He never finished his sentence. A sound echoed from across the water. Voices, distant but drawing closer. Male voices, hard and rough. The sound of men who were used to taking what they wanted. Both brothers froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. How many? Gideon breathed. 3, maybe 4, Sterling whispered back, quickly folding the document and hiding it. They know we're here. The voices grew louder, punctuated by the scrape of heavy boots on stone. Whoever had followed them, whoever had been hunting them, they were done with hiding. Sterling grabbed his brother's arm, his grip like iron. He pointed a trembling finger at the carved stone altar. The grooves. They're not just patterns. His eyes were alight with a terrifying realization. They're instructions. Instructions for what? Before he could answer, a new voice cut through the air, cold and sharp and full of command. It echoed off the high stone walls, surrounding them. Coulter brothers, we know you're in there! Gideon and Sterling flattened themselves against the cold rock wall, trying to disappear into the stone. The voice came again, closer this time, dripping with a false predatory friendliness. Your uncle made us a promise before he died. We're here to make sure you honor it. Sterling pressed his back into the unforgiving stone, his breath catching in his throat. Footsteps crunched on the gravel at the entrance to the amphitheater. Heavy, deliberate. They were being cornered. Gideon clutched a loose, heavy rock, his knuckles turning bone white. Your uncle was a practical man, the voice boomed, bouncing off the rock walls, coming from everywhere at once. He understood business. He understood that some secrets are too profitable not to share. 3 men stepped into the amphitheater. They were dressed in simple miners' clothes, but their faces were hard, chiseled from the same unforgiving stone as the island. The man in the lead, older, with eyes like chips of flint, swept his gaze across the empty space. He wasn't looking for them. He was assessing, calculating, like a wolf entering a sheep pen. Ezra Coulter made a deal, the man said, his eyes finally landing on the carved altar in the center. He agreed to let us work this island. In return, we helped him keep its secrets safe from prying eyes. He paused, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Now that he's gone, that arrangement passes to his heirs. Sterling and Gideon exchanged a look of pure confusion. A deal? Their uncle was a rancher, not a conspirator. But the raw confidence in the man's voice was unshakable. He believed every word he was saying. No point in hiding, boys, the leader called out. Let's be civilized. Slowly, Gideon stood, pulling Sterling up with him. They stepped out from behind the rock formation. The leader's flinty eyes immediately darted to the bulge in Sterling's vest. A flicker of triumph crossed his face. There it is, he said with satisfaction. The map. Ezra promised us his full cooperation. You will honor that promise. We don't know anything about a promise, Gideon said, his voice steadier than he felt. The leader's smile was thin and dangerous. Your uncle stumbled onto something here, 20 years ago. Something valuable. Valuable enough to kill for. He let that hang in the air. We've been his silent partners ever since. Sterling's hand went to his vest, to the document that now felt like it was burning a hole through his chest. What did he find? Now that's the right question. The leader, Marcus, gestured to his 2 men, who began to spread out, cutting off any chance of escape. Ezra discovered that this worthless tooth of an island sits right on top of a mine. Not just any mine, boys. A deposit of precious metals so rich it could make us all kings. The carved stone table, the grooves. It all clicked into place in Sterling's mind. They weren't just patterns. They were survey lines. Blueprints. A map carved in stone, pointing to a treasure buried right beneath their feet. The stone formations, the documents, the isolation. It was the perfect cover for an illegal mining operation. But something was wrong. The story didn't fit. "If you were already working with him," Sterling asked, his voice careful, "why did he leave the island to us? Why not just give it to you?" The question landed like a physical blow. For a split second, the leader's confidence wavered. A flash of something dark and violent showed in his eyes before he masked it. "Because your uncle," he said, his voice dropping into a low snarl, "got greedy, decided he wanted to change the terms of our deal. Unfortunately for him, he had a little accident before we could come to a new arrangement." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. These weren't partners. They were killers. Their uncle hadn't lost his mind. He hadn't died of old age. He'd been murdered. And just as that horrifying realization settled over them, a new sound split the air. Not a voice. The sharp crack of a wooden hull scraping hard against rock. Another boat had just landed. A chorus of new voices echoed from the shore, shouting orders. Marcus cursed, his head whipping around. He shoved his men toward the cover of the rocks. "Who else knows about this place?" Gideon whispered, but Marcus ignored him, his entire being focused on the new threat. Sterling clutched the document. This was spiraling out of control. 20 years of secrecy, and now, on the day of their arrival, the island was suddenly crowded. "Stay down and stay quiet," Marcus hissed at the brothers. "Those aren't friends of ours." The new arrivals were moving fast, with a purpose that suggested they knew exactly where they were going. Sterling could hear at least 4 of them, their voices carrying clearly in the strange acoustics of the stone amphitheater. "The Coulter boys beat us to it," one of the new voices called out. "Their boat's on the north shore." Another voice replied, "Good. Saves us the trouble of hunting them down in town." Sterling's blood ran cold. These men weren't just here for the island. They were here for them. How? How could anyone have known? Beside them, Marcus had gone rigid. His hand slipped slowly inside his coat. His men did the same. They weren't just hiding. They were preparing for a war. And the Coulter brothers were standing right in the middle of the killing ground. There was nowhere to run. The amphitheater was a stone trap. The only way out was the way the newcomers were coming in. The first of them appeared at the entrance. He was a tall man, dressed in a dark coat that seemed out of place on the rugged island. He surveyed the scene with cold, intelligent eyes. His gaze swept past the brothers, past the altar, and settled on Marcus, who was half hidden behind a boulder. "Marcus," the newcomer said. The name was a whip crack. "Still trying to steal what doesn't belong to you." Marcus stepped out from cover, his hand still inside his coat. "The deal was made 20 years ago, Caldwell. These boys inherited their uncle's debt to me." Caldwell smiled, a humorless baring of teeth. "Funny thing about deals made with dead men. They have a tendency to expire." Sterling felt the weight of the document in his vest. It was the center of this storm. Both Marcus and this new man, Caldwell, kept glancing at him, their eyes hungry. "We're here on behalf of the territorial government," Caldwell announced, his voice ringing with authority. "Investigating reports of illegal mining." He let his gaze fall on the brothers. Imagine our surprise when the Coulter name came up. Marcus's hand tightened on his weapon. "You have no jurisdiction here." "Actually," Caldwell said, gesturing to his men who fanned out, their own weapons now visible, "we have all the authority we need." He pointed directly at Sterling and Gideon. "The brothers are coming with us. They have a lot of questions to answer about their uncle's criminal enterprise." They were trapped. No matter who won this fight, they were going to end up as prisoners, or corpses. Sterling's panicked eyes darted around the stone trap, and then he saw it. The grooves in the altar, the measurements in his uncle's notes, a specific sequence of numbers he hadn't understood before. They weren't for a mine. They were coordinates. They pointed to a narrow, almost invisible crack between two massive stones at the back of the amphitheater. It wasn't a blueprint. It was an escape route. Uncle Ezra had planned for this. He'd planned for betrayal. If you're enjoying this story of secrets and survival, do me a favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now! Sterling yelled, grabbing Gideon's arm and shoving him toward the crack in the wall. You're not going anywhere! Caldwell shouted, but it was too late. His attention was divided, his eyes on Marcus's men. The first gunshot cracked through the air, deafening in the enclosed space. As the amphitheater erupted into a firefight, Sterling and Gideon squeezed through the narrow passage, plunging into darkness. The gap opened into a tunnel, perfectly carved from the living rock, just wide enough for a single person. It twisted deep into the heart of the island. How did he build all this? Gideon panted, stumbling through the dark. Dim light filtered down from small shafts cut into the ceiling. Sterling pulled out the document, trying to read the frantic script in the gloom. Marcus said he was here for 20 years, but this feels much older. The tunnel split, then it split again. A maze, but each fork was marked with a tiny, almost invisible symbol carved into the rock. The symbols matched the notations on their uncle's paper. Sterling's heart pounded with a new revelation. Their uncle hadn't just been mining. He hadn't just been hiding. He'd found this place. Someone else built these tunnels, Sterling said, his voice full of awe. Uncle Ezra just found them. He mapped them. They followed a route marked with 3 parallel lines, climbing steeply upwards. The air grew fresher. They emerged onto a high, narrow ledge overlooking the entire island. Below them, in the amphitheater, the gunfight had stopped. Both groups of men were spreading out, searching for them. I don't see any mine, Gideon said, scanning the barren landscape. No shafts, no tailings, no equipment. Sterling looked at the document, then back at the amphitheater below. He lined up the measurements, the angles, the strange symbols. And then he understood. His blood ran cold. The mining wasn't on the surface. It was under the amphitheater. They're standing on it, Sterling whispered in horror. The whole floor of that chamber. It's hollow. As if his words had conjured it, a low, deep rumbling sound started, vibrating up through the soles of their boots. It came from the very depths of the island. Down below, the men stopped their search, looking around in confusion and alarm. The ground beneath their feet was shaking. What's happening? Gideon yelled, grabbing Sterling's arm to steady himself. Sterling frantically scanned the document, finding a section he'd overlooked, full of engineering notes about load-bearing and stress points. His uncle hadn't just been digging. He'd been trying to hold the whole thing up. The supports, Sterling breathed, his voice tight with dawning terror. He built wooden supports to keep the roof of the cavern from collapsing, to keep the amphitheater floor from caving in. Another rumble, stronger this time, a deep, grinding groan from the rock beneath them. Below, Marcus and Caldwell's men were stumbling, trying to keep their balance on the shifting stone. 20 years of digging, Gideon said. How much did he take out? Sterling found the last entries in the notes. Frantic calculations. The cavern below wasn't just a mine. It was a vast, hollowed-out tomb, stretching the entire width of the amphitheater. Uncle Ezra had dug too deep. He'd taken too much. All of it, Sterling whispered. He took almost all of it. The next rumble was violent. It was accompanied by a horrifying sound, the sharp crack of stone giving way. Down below, a thin black fracture line appeared, racing across the center of the carved stone altar, splitting the ancient patterns in two. Marcus and Caldwell finally understood. They were standing on their own grave. They started shouting, ordering their men to run. But Sterling, reading the last shaky words his uncle had ever written, knew it was already too late. Supports failing. Chamber too large. The island cannot hold. The rumbling was constant now, a death rattle from the heart of the mountain. And as they watched in horror, their inheritance began to tear itself apart. But the document held one last secret, a final location, marked with a frantic, desperate symbol. A location his uncle had labeled the real treasure. And it was nowhere near the collapsing amphitheater. Sterling's finger traced the final set of coordinates on the weathered page. A location on the far eastern shore of the island, marked with a symbol that looked like a coiled serpent. As the ground continued to shudder beneath them, he knew. The mine, the danger, the years of secrecy. It had all been a diversion. A massive, deadly distraction to protect something else. Something far more important. "We have to get to the other side of the island," Sterling yelled over the growing roar. "Now! Before this whole place comes down!" They scrambled along the high ledge, following a path only their uncle could have known, marked by nearly invisible notches carved into the rock. The island was a labyrinth of hidden crevices and narrow passages. Behind them, the shouts of Marcus and Caldwell's men grew more frantic as they tried to escape the collapsing amphitheater. The rumbling was no longer intermittent. It was a constant, deep-throated groan. The devil's tooth was breaking. "How much time do we have?" Gideon gasped, pulling himself over a rocky outcrop. Sterling glanced at his uncle's structural notes. Ezra was a brilliant engineer. He designed the supports to fail in stages, a cascade. We have maybe an hour before the main cavern implodes and takes half the island with it. They finally reached the eastern shore. The coastline here was completely different. The jagged rocks formed a perfect hidden cove, sheltered from the open sea. It was a natural harbor, and it had been used for a very long time. "Look," Gideon said, pointing to grooves worn smooth in the stone at the water's line. "Dozens of boats have landed here, for years." Sterling checked the document, his heart hammered in his chest. The compass bearings, the tidal charts, they were standing on the exact spot marked with the coiled serpent. The spot his uncle called the real treasure. But there was nothing here. Just an empty cove. And then he saw it. Hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss and weathered rock, so perfectly concealed it was almost a part of the cliff face, was the dark opening of a cave. The entrance was partially blocked by a pile of carefully placed stones, meant to look like a natural rock slide. "This," Sterling breathed, "is where he really worked." They pulled the stones aside, revealing a passage that led straight into the island's core. Unlike the raw, dangerous tunnels under the amphitheater, this one was different. The walls were smooth, the floor was level, and the ceiling was reinforced with heavy wooden beams. This wasn't a mine. It was a vault. The passage opened into a vast, breathtaking cavern. The air was cool and still. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with heavy wooden shelves and meticulously organized crates. But it wasn't the neatness that made them stop dead. It was what was on the shelves. Dozens of chests overflowed with gold coins from a dozen different empires. Stacks of silver bars gleamed in the dim light. Crates were filled with uncut gemstones, sparkling like captured stars. And on velvet-lined shelves sat artifacts, golden masks, jeweled swords, ancient pottery that looked like they belonged in a king's museum. This wasn't a miner's hoard. This was a king's ransom. "This isn't from a mine," Gideon whispered in awe, lifting a heavy gold medallion covered in strange, intricate symbols. "This is collected, stolen." On a heavy oak table in the center of the cavern lay a thick, leather-bound journal. Sterling opened it. It was his uncle's handwriting, and the story it told changed everything. 20 years ago, Ezra Coulter had stumbled upon this island and found the network of ancient tunnels. And in this very cavern, he had found the treasure. It was already here, left behind by pirates, or perhaps some forgotten Spanish galleon, a legendary lost treasure. But instead of running off with it, his uncle had done something extraordinary. He had spent the next 2 decades here, in secret, not stealing the treasure, but protecting it. The mine was never the point, Sterling said, reading the words aloud. It was a decoy, the perfect misdirection. Anyone who got too close would find the secret mine, and never think to look for anything else. The journal explained the genius of the plan. Ezra had cataloged every single piece in the collection. He'd used the small income from the decoy mine to fund his real work, researching the artifacts and finding legitimate buyers, museums and historical societies who would preserve the items. He wasn't a thief, he was a guardian. But the very last entry made Sterling's blood freeze. Marcus is getting suspicious. He thinks I'm holding out on him. May have to trigger the collapse to protect the collection. The island is the final lock on the vault. Outside, the rumbling intensified. The final lock was about to turn. The collapse of the mine would bring official investigators crawling all over what was left of the island. This cave, this incredible secret, would be found. Sterling slammed the journal shut. We have to get this out of here, before the whole island sinks. But as he spoke, a shadow fell across the entrance of the cave. The sound of crunching gravel echoed from the passage behind them. Familiar voices, angry voices, the voices of men who had survived the collapse and followed them to their uncle's greatest secret. Marcus stood at the cave entrance, his clothes shredded, his face a mask of soot and fury. 2 of his men staggered behind him, bruised but alive. His flinty eyes widened as he took in the cavern filled with gold and jewels. Well, well, Marcus rasped, a greedy smile spreading across his ruined face. Looks like old Ezra had more secrets than I thought. Sterling clutched the journal to his chest. Gideon moved to stand between Marcus and the priceless artifacts. There was no other exit. They were trapped. The mine was just a distraction, Marcus said, stepping into the cavern, his eyes devouring the treasure. He was hiding all this for himself. You murdered him for it, Sterling said, his voice cold and steady. Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Your uncle tried to cut me out. He forgot that partnerships like ours are for life. He gestured to his men. Doesn't matter now. Start packing it up. All of it. His men moved forward, but before they could touch a single coin, another voice echoed from the passage. A voice of cold, hard authority. I wouldn't touch that if I were you, Marcus. Marcus spun around. Caldwell and his 3 men stood blocking the entrance, their guns drawn and steady. They were just as battered as Marcus's men, but they were organized. They were in control. This entire collection, Caldwell announced, stepping into the light, is now evidence in a federal investigation. It belongs to the government. This is private property, Marcus snarled. You have no right. Actually, Caldwell said, pulling a folded, official-looking document from his coat, we do. This island and everything on it has been designated a site of historical importance. It's all ours now. Sterling felt a wave of despair. They were saved from Marcus, only to lose everything to the government. Their inheritance, their uncle's life's work, would be swallowed by bureaucracy. Then, his eyes fell upon the open journal in his hands. He saw a section he'd missed. Tucked into sleeves in the back cover were duplicates. Bills of sale, letters of provenance, legal documents. His uncle hadn't just been a guardian. He'd been a lawyer. Wait, Sterling said, his voice cutting through the tense standoff. He stepped forward, holding the journal open. This treasure doesn't belong to you, Marcus, and it doesn't belong to the government. Every gun in the cave turned toward him. Sterling didn't flinch. He read directly from his uncle's meticulous notes. Every single piece in this collection has a documented history. It's been legally acquired, either through salvage rights or from defunct estates. Each item has a verified chain of ownership and a pre-negotiated sale agreement with an accredited museum or a private scholarly collector. He looked directly at Caldwell. My uncle wasn't a treasure hunter. He was running a legitimate antiquities business. This isn't a hoard. It's an inventory. Marcus's face fell as the meaning of the words sank in. You're saying it's all legal? Perfectly legal, Sterling said, flipping through page after page of signed contracts and notarized documents. Uncle Ezra kept perfect records. This cave is a warehouse, waiting for delivery. Caldwell snatched the journal, his eyes scanning the documents. His official certainty began to crumble, replaced by disbelief, then grudging respect. The paperwork was ironclad. But before he could speak, the loudest roar yet ripped through the island. The very floor of the cavern heaved. Huge cracks shot across the ceiling, and chunks of rock began to rain down. "We have to go now!" Gideon screamed over the noise. "The whole cave is coming down!" In that moment of chaos, Sterling made a choice. He wasn't thinking about money or ownership. He was thinking about his uncle's legacy. He started grabbing the smallest, most valuable crates and shoving them into the arms of the nearest men. "Take it!" he yelled. "Take what you can carry! Marcus Caldwell, it doesn't matter! If we don't get this out of here, it's lost forever!" For one crazy, impossible moment, the two rival groups, the killers and the lawmen, stared at him. Then, primal survival and a shared sudden respect for the history around them took over. Greed and authority were forgotten. All that mattered was the rescue. It became a frantic, desperate race against time. A human chain formed, passing priceless artifacts from hand to hand out of the collapsing cave. Sterling and Gideon worked alongside the very men who had tried to kill and capture them. Marcus's men, driven by simple greed, loaded their boat with gold and silver. Caldwell's group, more disciplined, focused on the historically priceless artifacts. Sterling held onto the journal. He knew the papers in his hands were more valuable than all the gold in the world. "The island's finished!" Gideon shouted as they tossed the last crate into a boat. Behind them, the entrance to the secret cove began to crumble, the cliff face shearing off in massive slabs. They shoved the boats off the shore just as the ground gave way, the entire eastern coast of the island slumping into the churning sea. From the water, they watched as their inheritance, the Devil's Tooth, the site of their uncle's life's work, collapsed in on itself and sank beneath the waves, taking its secrets with it. 3 days later, Sterling stood in a territorial courthouse. The room was packed. The rescued treasure was piled on tables, guarded by armed marshals. Caldwell was there, representing the government's claim. Marcus was there with a lawyer, demanding a share based on his partnership. Representatives from 3 different museums had arrived, summoned by telegram. Sterling simply opened his uncle's journal. He laid out the story, piece by piece, document by document. He proved every artifact was legally accounted for. He showed the court the pre-signed contracts, the paid deposits from museums, the letters of intent from scholars around the world. "Gentlemen," Sterling said, his voice clear and confident in the silent room. "My uncle wasn't a criminal. He was a preservationist, and this is his estate." The documentation was undeniable. Caldwell had to concede that the entire operation was astoundingly legal. Marcus's claims, when faced with records showing he had been paid handsomely for years for security services, evaporated into nothing. The court had no choice. It ruled that Gideon and Sterling Coulter were the sole, rightful inheritors of their uncle's business and his entire incredible collection. 6 months passed. Sterling stood in the new, handsome offices of the Coulter Antiquities Preservation Company. He was reading a letter from a university in California, hiring them to consult on a new discovery. Across the room, Gideon was happily tallying the accounts from their latest sale to a wealthy East Coast collector. Their inheritance had been a worthless rock, but it had hidden a treasure beyond their wildest dreams. Not a treasure of gold, but of purpose. They had inherited their uncle's legacy, his reputation, and his life's noble work. Marcus, his legal claims dismissed, ended up taking a job as a security guard for a mining company in another territory. Caldwell received a commendation for his role in recovering the priceless historical artifacts. The island itself was gone, a footnote on nautical charts. But the work of Ezra Coulter lived on. His nephews had learned the greatest lesson he could teach them: that true value is rarely on the surface, and that real wealth isn't what you take from the world, but what you save for it. The brothers had found their treasure, and it was a future they had never imagined. If you enjoyed this incredible tale of hidden treasures and family legacy, click on the next video appearing on your screen to discover another unforgettable story where courage and determination lead to extraordinary discoveries. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story captured your imagination, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing frontier adventures. Consider leaving a super chat to support our storytelling. Your contributions help us research and create these detailed historical narratives that bring the untamed frontier to life. Every bit of support allows us to dedicate more time to crafting these immersive stories that transport you to another time and place.